Okay, John, I think we've ended up with 20 people in
Oh,
the
nice.
so a
That's
couple
great.
people wrote me that they may not be here today, but
That's all right.
I think most of them can come usually.
Most of the time.
Most of
Well, you know what they say about most of the people most of the time.
That's right. Yes, you want to avoid that, actually.
Well, good. Good deal. As you can probably hear in my voice, I'm on the tail end of a cold my kids gave me. So if I hack and wheeze and sniffle, I apologize. Um, I'm prepared.
That's the danger of having children. They bring home diseases.
I'm convinced they go to school and they lick stuff. Um, Yeah, so yeah, we've had rolling viruses for about 3 weeks now, and it finally caught me. But I'm doing all right. I'm on the upward swing of the thing. So, let's see here. So we've got 5 folks here now. We'll give people.
We're still 10 minutes out, so
Okay.
roughly.
Good deal. Good deal.
Uh,
And has everyone been able to get into the Canvas site, and have they been able to get to the PDFs and all that kind of stuff? Okay, good. Good, good, good. Awesome. Oh, that's my tea timer.
yeah, as far as I know, everything's up and running. I was just saying to the guys, I scheduled this meeting and the Zoom scheduled two meetings. And
Oh,
I'm not quite sure why it did that,
okay.
but so hopefully there's
Hopefully
no,
everybody makes it to the right one.
yeah.
I suppose they'll figure it out if they
Well,
have been
I
there a little
did
while.
I sent an email link too. So
Okay, good. All right. Well, that's good. Good deal. But well, good. I'm excited about this.
let me tell you who's who here, Jonathan. That
Yeah, would you please? And we'll do. I'll let people introduce themselves here as well once we get going. But yeah, by all means.
Okay, so Nate is up in my left-hand corner. Nate has a podcast that he does called Grail Country, uh, and just did a fantastic interview with me.
Getting the top tier guests. Look at you.
Yeah, yeah. And then the next day, I wrote this blog on David Bentley Hart, and I think I turned all of his listeners against me.
Oh.
I didn't mean to schedule those right back to back, but
Was your blog for or against?
yeah, kind of just a critique of his, he's come out recently and confessed. What his confession amounted to is debatable, but in part, he did not want to identify with as a Christian, but I think whether he still wants to be one, maybe,
Hmm.
but not churched in any way. And so he's kind, and I just read another thing he sent out to somebody else that he's not going to do. He claimed not to be a theologian, and he's not going to do theology. He says he's given up on.
Him and Chesterton are on accord on that one then.
Oh, okay. And Chester, how so?
Chesterton would sort of famously disclaimed being a theologian, despite writing on arguably theological topics
Yeah.
almost entirely.
Yeah, David's always maintained that he's not a theologian though, because his degree is in religious studies and not theology.
Sure. I in some way, I mean, in some ways, David is a time traveling 19th century philologist. Um, yeah.
That's what we just had a podcast, and there's a guy here who is an expert in languages and a philol, and he reminds me so much of Hart, just kind of the cranky, similar.
Too
Uh,
much time spent with dictionaries.
yeah, yeah, and certainly in no way would claim to be. In fact, dislikes theologians and people who make the presumption to,
Oh,
even.
nice. Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, the true 19th century philological
Yeah,
spirit.
yeah.
Yeah.
uh, yeah. No, I just pointed out that the conclusion that he's come to was not disconnected from where he's been in the past.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I just do an arc of his overall work.
Got it.
Um,
Uh, I I'll never speak too ill of Hart, in part because he's a consummate promoter of Lonergan's work. So I'd
yeah,
be
he seems to be a bit ambiguous though. He never claims to have engaged Lonergan, has he?
he uh he he has read he's for sure read Insight and for sure read Grace and Freedom. Um, in part, and I know that because he we brought him to Marquette and he gave a really good paper, giving a kind of exitus reditus Neoplatinian read of the two together, which I think has since been published in his what's that thing called? Is it Theological Territories, or what's the name of that volume of essays?
Yeah, yeah.
It
That
appeared
sounds.
in there. He made fun of the name of our graduate conference, but everyone did because it had a silly name. So,
I think Ryan may have told me about that.
oh, okay, yeah.
Ryan,
Yeah, this is Ryan Hemmer is my theological territories. Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, my Ryan Hemmer is a colleague of mine. We went to Marquette together, and we co-led the uh, what was it called? The Lonergan Society, I guess. But we put on a graduate student conference that we inherited the name Lonergan on the Edge, which is admittedly silly. I tried to get my teacher Robert Dorn to change it on a number of occasions and never talked him into it. Um, But yeah, so we brought that was the year that I think we broke Bob's heart a little bit. We brought both David Bentley Hart and Matthew Levering to campus to give our keynotes, and
he,
I think Bob thought of us as letting uh, the wolves into the henhouse.
uh, he was not a Hart fan then, huh?
Well, I think for Bob, I think it was a matter of uh, I think it was a matter of sort of cultural camps. Um, he saw them as being party to the opposed cultural camp.
Uh, yeah, I know Ryan had dealings with Hart, but he seemed to have kind of shifted his view of him.
Well, so maybe if Hart is a touch point, we can maybe it might be interesting actually to use him as an example in our discussion today. Um, because one of the things I notice in his particularly in his book on the natural and the supernatural is that what Lonergan calls the logical ideal of science is the predominating uh, intellectual technique um, that Hart seems to use. Um, and that has certain powers and it has certain limitations. All right, how are we doing on numbers here? We're up to 12. Do you have some sense of how many weren't going to be able to make it?
I don't know, but we're pretty close. We're 2 minutes out.
All right.
So I think any time that you want to begin, I'll just leave it to you however you
Right.
want.
Well, we'll give folks a couple minutes to get situated. I know I had to stash a 4-year-old with a tablet and some headphones to get this going. So, um,
I'll take the opportunity to say I'm sorry. I might have to leave. Well, we'll have to leave a little bit early today. I'm at some friends visiting, so I wanted to pop in and see as much as I could and say hello and Looking
Well,
forward to more.
I appreciate that, and absolve you of your sin against hospitality.
Yeah,
But
he's left his friends in the other room. This is Brian. Brian is one of my
Hey, Brian.
longtime students, Brian Sarter.
huh,
So
nice to
uh,
meet you.
you're having a vacation with your friends and you've abandoned them to join the Lonergan class.
For the life of the mind.
I just took my peanut butter and jelly in the other room. I'm gonna join them for beer in a little while.
Well, there you go. What kind of beers are we drinking?
We're in Atlanta. There's a little pub down the road that really nice place. It's in the basement of an old building, and I don't know. We've enjoyed it last night and decided we'd go back this afternoon to continue our discussions.
That's a good sign if you want to go back. Oh, nice.
I'm sure that'll inspire a lot of theological depth. The stronger the beer.
The guy,
There's a
Brian, the
certain
guy who
curve
pushed
function.
Brian, the guy who pushed me into starting Grill Country lives in Atlanta.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
You've mentioned
Michael Lady. Yeah, he's the
Mm.
guy who was like said you have to start a channel, and he had to like insist like many times before I finally agreed.
Well, I'll watch out for him at the pub.
Or else,
We're in like
watch out,
Kansas.
you might get talked into hosting a podcast.
Oh, Nate's trying to get me into that, I think. He's carrying it on. He's pushing paying it forward.
There you go. Yeah. That's as the Bible says, wherever, two or more are gathered, you might start a podcast.
And if each one we reach one. Yeah.
There's always that danger that one will just start up. You never know.
Nice. Okay. Well, hey, yeah, 13. Why don't we get going? I'm so I put up in Canvas a proportionately small excerpt from the Summa Theologica, from the first question in the first part. Um, but and I put that sort of very sketchy biographical piece on Lonergan in there, and I'm have aims to talk about both. But before I do that, I would like to know, who we've been getting to know each other a little bit here, but I'd like to be a little more systematic about it. And if you, whether with camera or without, pop on for a minute and just tell us who you are, where you're at, why you thought this was worth committing, 7 or 8 weeks to. What caught your interest, why you wanted to do it. I'm both curious just because I'm interested to get to know you, but also if to have some sense of what questions or interests you bring to the discussion. As I prepare, I can hopefully try and hit some of those touchstones along the way as best I can. So, um, yeah. Anyway, I'll let you do it under your own recognizance here. If anybody wants to lead off,
I'll start.
thanks, Brian.
I'm Brian Sarter. I'm from North Carolina, and I've been taking classes with Paul Axton and Forging Plowshares for a few years. And I don't know much about Lonergan, really, but was fascinated mostly by hearing you and Paul talk about it in y'all's podcast release, and yeah, just identifying the issues of method in our age and seeing him as um, a good way to address it. I'm excited and thankful to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Brian.
Was there anything else that you wanted to cover us to cover in terms of?
Whatever in a brief little bit you're willing to share is fine. That was great.
Yeah, the only thing I'll throw in there is I'm a minister. I'm trained in at divinity school training, but I'm a hospice chaplain. That's what I do
Cool.
full time. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
I guess I'll go next. I'm Nate Heil. As Paul mentioned, I have a podcast, a YouTube channel, and a YouTube channel called Grail Country. Um, most most of what I talk about is philosophical and theological topics. And I decided to take, I've been taking courses from Paul for a while. And the first one I took was Jordan Daniel Wood's course uh, on Maximus, because Jordan and I had a previous relationship because he'd been on Grail Country a few times, and we kind of like became friends online. And we met up in Eugene at Mount Angel, and I bought him dinner. So we actually have met in person at least one time. So we kind of have a friendship with Jordan. And so when I saw he was teaching a class, that's what wrote me into taking classes from Paul. And this particular one, the reason I signed up for it is because I actually read your piece on the chaotic beauty of Walter White in the Church Life Journal back in 2018, which I thought was outstanding. So it's like, oh, okay, that's the instructor. And then in terms of Lonergan, I know nothing about. I know the name. I know just the barest amount. I've had Roberto de la Naval on Grill Country, and I know that Lonergan has his other interests other than Bulgakov. So, but I don't really. But I'm excited to learn. I did pick up one of my I'm very much I have a very kind of evolution of consciousness, anthroposophical kind of bent to almost all of my content on Grill Country. And I and some of the things that I read in the introduction made me see some possible overlaps just in the way, just in the language that was used about like the idea of historical consciousness and the discursive being primary to cognition, because that's one of Barfield's big thing is to try to get people out of the primary third person consciousness. So
Excellent. Well, thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
And thanks for reading the church life piece.
yeah.
You fire those things off into the universe and you never know you never know where they
I
land.
thought it
So,
was fantastic. It
oh,
was really
thanks.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Well, terrific. Thanks.
Yep.
If I can go next, I think. My name is Alan, and I took classes with uh, Mr. Axton during my bachelor's, and also took all the classes for forging plowshares. Uh, I, I grew up in Mexico, and I'm doing missions down in Mexico as well. So I preach at a small church. I'm starting a new church plant. I also teach in a Bible college online, and I'm also doing like forging plowshares, but in Spanish for people here. So that will be kind of my background there. And with Lonergan, I've actually read Insight, Method in Theology, and Grace and Freedom. I read these with a book club with uh, other guys, but it was a confusing time because I was reading them in Spanish while they were reading it in English, so we were kind of getting mixed up there. But uh, I always thought Lonergan was brilliant, but also very confusing. So the more I can hear from him from different angles, different teachers, I think it brings a new perspective on how to understand what he's saying. So yeah, that's why I jumped into this class.
Thanks, Alan. Where in Mexico are you?
I grew up in Mexico City, but I live in Manzanillo.
Okay.
That's where I've been for the last like 14 years, I think.
Oh, okay.
So it's been a while. I'm married to somebody that grew up here, so I'm staying here.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm happy to go. Uh, since Rob Dylan mentioned, he's a close friend of mine, and so I'm Joshua McManaway. I am on faculty at the McGrath Institute for Church Life, which publishes Church Life Journal, and I teach theology at the University of Notre Dame. I'm a historian of Christianity, so I mostly teach things like history of the papacy or intro to early Christianity or things like that. But I was part of the same Lonergan reading group here at Notre Dame. We tried to form a kind of Lonerganian, outpost away from Marquette, away from BC. But I'm the least of the Lonerganians, and so I thought if I got a chance to read with Dr. Heaps and with all of you guys, I might advance maybe from least Lonerganians to middling. That's my goal.
So that you have Middle Platonism. We'll see if we can establish a middle Lonerganianism. Yeah.
I'm Andrew Greenhaw. I'm not trying to be antisocial, but I got a new laptop and I can't figure out how to turn on the camera at present. As soon as I do, you'll see me. I'm a pastor in the United Church of Christ. I serve the Congregational Church of Rochester, Minnesota. And I know very, very little about Lonergan, but I'd kind of been getting into some Catholic new theology with DeLu Bach and stuff like that. And I thought this might be uh, interesting to learn more about.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right. Don't be
I'm
shy.
Michael.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'm Michael. I work at a United Methodist Church out here in Portland, Oregon. And I don't know too much about Lonergan. I think the first time I encountered his name was through John Milbank, and he kind of just like passes Lonergan off as like a Kantian. And it seems like you have a much more metaphysically expansive view, maybe, of Lonergan. So I look forward to learning more about that.
I have gone back and forth on Twitter, formerly known as, with Milbank a few times, and on two of the four occasions I was able to convince John that Lonergan was not a Kantian and shared his criticisms of Scotus. But then the other two times we lost the equilibrium, unfortunately. So,
Oh no.
but yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
I'll go. I'll follow up on the Portland connection. So, my name is Francis, and I'm in Portland, Oregon, also by way of born in California and just moved up here a few years back. Um, I studied or was exposed to Lonergan back in the early 80s through some theological studies, and have kind of kept up a, a, a passing interest in him over the years and appreciation of his stuff. But professionally, it doesn't take me there. And I got the course because I was following Professor Heaps on formerly known as Twitter, and then I saw about the course and wanted to take it and figured what the hell not. So anyway, that's why I'm here.
Well, that's great. I appreciate it. Where did you bump into Lonergan
So I was studying to be a Vincentian priest, so I got him in theology at we were part of the consortium out of Chicago.
Okay.
Theology at the time. It's closed now, but
Yeah.
but I got exposed to insight and philosophy for undergrad, and then method and other stuff. I mean, other
Yeah, sure.
stuff.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Well, thanks. Glad to have you.
happy to be here.
I'll jump in on the formerly known as Twitter connection. So I ran into Lonergan towards the tail end of school, out of personal interest, for some overlapping questions in academic research, but pastoral ministry. And right now I'm director of evangelization for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Davenport in Iowa, and continue to find Lonergan relevant in that space. And so on Twitter, my initial sort of like seeds of interest have been watered, as it were, by the ongoing presence of folks such as Dr. Heaps, and wanted to engage Lonergan in a more kind of systematic setting as opposed to sort of reading on my own and seeing where things lead.
Great. Thanks. Glad to have you. And I'll put you on blast that you do. I've seen you do a marvelous job on a number of occasions. Communicate some Lonergan ideas to your diocese in your. Is it a newsletter or a new? What's the? I've read those a couple times. You do a wonderful job with them.
Thanks. Yeah, it's primarily the diocesan newspaper.
Yeah. So we'll see if we can load up your hopper with some more stuff.
Perfect.
Everybody needs content.
It's true.
All right. All right. Who else do we got?
Jump in.
I can go.
My name's Joelle. I live in St. Louis, and I'm Paul's youngest child, which is how I heard about the class. But I've read a little bit from the collected works in school when I was taking some classes on Thomas. I just sort of picked and choose some essays that were talking about the questions of Thomas we were reading and enjoyed that. So excited to learn more.
Great. Thanks so much. Glad to have you. That is my if you've seen me on social media, my canned advice when people say, I want to read some Lonergan, my canned advice is often to go grab one of the essay collections and be mercenary in this table of contents and just, if there's something that looks interesting to you, read those things, and if it doesn't look interesting, don't read it. Um, so that we'll go through some stuff sort of systematically here, but if you head out on your own into Lonergan land, that remains my sort of baseline advice. Um, all right, great. Who else?
Potentially just me, unless I'm miscounting. I'm Xavier. I'm in Oakland, and I'm here for, I guess, intellectual curiosity and worldview expansion. I've grown up around a lot of Catholicism, and I've had Lonergan recommended to me many times. Uh, and even though I have not yet made myself read Insight, from what I know of Lonergan and have read about him, I really like his commitment to intellectual honesty, which I don't want to use to denigrate other academics, but I like what he seems to focus on
Hmm.
and his breadth of um, and his interdisciplinariness.
And you're in Oakland, California.
Mhm.
Those are very near my original stomping grounds. I grew up in the Diablo Valley.
Fun
Um,
times.
yeah. So I pretty rarely go back these days, but that is where I spent my formative years. Well, great. Thank you. And then I thought we got at least one more, right?
Yeah, hi,
Yeah.
everybody.
Oh, we got a few more. Okay, great. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Dempsey. I was introduced to Lonergan when I was an undergrad. I got my BA in theology from Boston College back in the 80s, the late 80s. And it was mind blowing, right? I mean, you're 20 years old, 21 years old, whatever it is. And Fred Lawrence and Pat Byrne and all these other people are just you know, laying him down as this alternative to all the other stuff you were studying in philosophy and theology classes. The way they had set up the curriculum is that the first couple of years you'd be in this class called Western Cultural Tradition, and it would start with Thales and it would end with Jung, and you'd read a little bit of everything to get this like commanding sweep, and you'd be left with all the problems. And then suddenly here's Lonergan and what he has to say, and it did seem to transpose everything into a new key that I found really liberating and fascinating. And so ever since, I've been reading him. I think about Lonergan every day. I did not go on to get an MDiv or an academic theology degree. I actually do theater. I teach acting and improvisation and use uh, that as uh, a way to kind of bring about self-appropriation sort of obliquely in the course of doing that kind of thing. I also work in healthcare and try to apply Lonergan there in terms of just being methodical in the way we do
And
things.
in what context do you teach acting?
Um, so I'm in the Bay Area. I'm north of you, Xavier. I'm up in Crockett, the very tip-top crown jewel of the East Bay. I teach at Solano Community College and a
Oh,
few other community colleges. I teach at Cal, and then just private studio classes.
great.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
sure.
So I've taken a few classes from Paul, starting back a year ago with Jordan Daniel Wood's class. Uh, been Catholic for a couple of years, and I'm from Tri-Cities, Washington. Going back to school now to get a philosophy master's, and I've enjoyed Paul's classes or as a podcast on Lonergan, on Forging Plowshares in the past, and he just strikes me as a good kind of mediating figure. So I appreciate his interest in like the scientific and historical and hermeneutical aspects, and his appreciation for Plato, it seems. So I was really influenced by the kind of Neoplatonic cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, as well as Milbank as well. And both Milbank and Jordan Daniel Wood seem to cast Lonergan as a kind of Kantian. So I'm looking forward to seeing how you would address their criticisms. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the class.
Yeah. Yeah, the question in the question with Jordan is an interesting one, because Jordan's concern passes through Hegel, and when Lonergan, when we can talk more about this in a minute, but when Lonergan thought he was going to go on and get a degree in philosophy, he spent a good long time working his way pretty seriously through a big stack of Hegel. And it's funny because Lonergan's read all this stuff, and he engages occasionally, but not usually at length. And so trying to figure out where he fits in there is kind of a triangulation exercise. If that's a question people are interested in, there's a guy who's now retired from Loyola Marymount named Mark Morelli, who made it kind of his whole project. So if you're interested in via if you took the class with Jordan, or if you kind of know Jordan's work, and you're interested in the kind of Catholic rehabilitation of Hegel, Mark's work might be an interesting point of connection. But we'll have plenty of time to talk about all that. But terrific. Thanks. So nice to meet you. All right. Is that everybody, or did we miss anybody? All right, Bill, go ahead. I think you're still muted. I can see if I can unmute you. Do I have the power? Paul, do you have the power? Hold on, baby. My 4-year-old's trying to get my attention. There we go.
Think I got it. Hey, yeah, sorry, hi folks. My name's Bill. I'm an animator who lives in New York City. I'm kind of on my back foot now. We're in the DC area. My mother-in-law just passed away, so I'm in the lobby of this nursing home right now. So that's why I don't really quite have my act together. But yeah, this is my first theology class of any kind, actually. So I've been interested in reading Lonergan for a couple of years, but kind of intimidated. So I've read one of Terry Tykeby's book, and I've listened to some lectures and interviews with you, Jonathan, and followed you on Twitter for a number of years. So I saw this back in December. I think you first announced this, and I was like, wow, this sounds like a nice way to get in, so I can get the confidence maybe to actually tackle reading insight or method in theology myself. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you, and thanks for joining us under difficult circumstances.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hold on. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to check on my iPadified 4-year-old over here and see what she needs, and then
I'll talk. Did everybody introduce themselves? I think, did we cover everybody? I'm Paul Axton, and you probably semi-familiar with me that I am the director of Forging Plowshares. Joelle, who is my daughter, actually read, I think it was Method in Theology. She read it to me. But she says I kept falling asleep, so I may not have captured the fullness of Bernard Lonergan. But I've got to know Jonathan through one of my students, Ryan Himmer, who was the editor-in-chief at Fortress Press, but kind of one of my star students. Not the only one, but maybe among the brightest of the stars. And when Ryan did his dissertation on Lonergan, and I may have understood Ryan's dissertation best of all on speculative theology, and just found it brilliant. And when I asked Ryan, he suggested, he recommended that Jonathan would be the premier person to lead a class on Lonergan. And so since then, I've gotten to know Jonathan. So, but anyway, really looking forward to the class.
Thanks, Paul. Well, all right. So Hannah's going to join us for a little bit. Hannah and I have been head cold buddies. So we're hanging out while the other kids are all at a school basketball game. But very quickly, just a little about me. I said some. If you listen to the podcast, I said some of this already. I grew up in a low church Protestant kind of a pietist movement called the Evangelical Covenant Church, and was very involved in that. I ended up going to that denomination's university in Chicago, North Park University, and I contemplated going and getting an MDiv at their seminary there, and ultimately decided that that probably wasn't where I was called to go. Um, and I ended up going to. I was in the had the interesting experience of my. Oh, babe. Now my dog wants my attention. Hey, everybody, we're having a great time. So, I ended up going to Boston College in part because my almost all my teachers at this little evangelical school in Chicago all had doctorate degrees from Jesuit universities. And so in my philosophy program there, I got a very kind of Catholic intellectual tradition, uh, intellectual formation. Um, in fact, I had one hilarious class it was not the capstone course, but it was pretty close to it in our philosophy program. It was called Anglo-American Thought, which should have been sort of English and American analytic philosophy, and instead what it ended up being was Alistair McIntyre's. Hey, baby, I need you to be quiet, okay? It was Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory, and Bernard Lonergan's Method and Theology. And I took that class. The mailman's here. I took that class, and then I sat in on it again because I was still captivated by the questions. The other figure I've done work on in addition to Lonergan is Maurice, the French Catholic philosopher Maurice Blondel, and it was actually Milbank was my introduction to Blondel in Chapter 8 of Theology and Social Theory. And in some ways, lo these decades later, I'm still working on some of the questions and such that I got in that undergraduate course. And I went and got a master's at BC and sort of solidified my interest in Lonergan there. And went after a couple of detours. I spent a year putting together a intentional Christian community connected to a church plant in California for a little, for like I said, about a year, and then um, my wife had one more, or yeah, at that point, fiance would be wife had one more year of law school in Boston, and so I moved back to Boston and did a master's in theology at Boston University, where I learned probably the biggest influence there was I learned American pragmatism from Robert Neville, and then from there we went to Milwaukee, and I did my doctorate at Marquette with the Lonergan student and Lonergan scholar, the Robert Doran, Father Robert Doran, who's also a Jesuit. Um, and yeah, and like Paul said, I wrote with Bob, as did Ryan. We both wrote on Lonergan, and we were Bob's last couple of students before he passed in 2021, I guess. Must have been January of 2021, I think is when he died. Um, so that's sort of a little thumbnail sketch of my intellectual biography. I am after went and lived in Texas for a while to be close to family because I got three of these Muppets. And so having family close by was very helpful. But I got the opportunity after another colleague of mine, Greg Floyd, got sort of the generational Lonergan philosophy job at Boston College. I drafted in behind him to become the director of the Lonergan Institute at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. So that is where we reside now. And I've been doing that for a year and a half. We host some lectures, and we put out a journal called the Lonergan Review. I've got an issue of it all ready to go. I'm waiting on contracts to get renewed with publishers and so forth. So yeah, that's kind of me. Like I said, I got three kids and a dog, and my wife's a public defender in the next county north. Uh, life is full. So I may have Muppets here with me. The dog may bark. Like I said, for those of you who didn't hear earlier, the kids gave me a cold, so I may snuffle and cough. I apologize. Um, all right, uh, John, can I have you hop in and introduce yourself?
You're talking about me, I'm assuming?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Hi, my name is John Crambiel. I'm the director of mission and ministry at a Jesuit high school, and have been interested in Lonergan for a really long time. I had some good mentors um, from folks down at Georgetown University. Um, so really excited to be here and to participate. So thank you. I am currently running a retreat, which is on a break, so I'll have to kind of come and go, but thank you.
Great. I understand. Life goes on. In fact, I think in a couple weeks I'll be doing this from Milwaukee because I'll be at oh honey, I'll be at uh, the Lonergan Marquette Connection is having their colloquium on I think it's on faith and ecology or something. So I'll be out there. So I'll probably be in a hotel room that way, which may make the whole thing a lot smoother as depending on how it's going right now. All right. Well, very good. So, let me see. How are we doing on time? I figured, Paul, you tell me. I figured probably about 90 minutes would be the kind of normal run of things. What do you think?
When Jordan was running things, we went between 3 to 4 hours.
Okay.
So
That sounds
yeah,
like Jordan. Uh,
that sounds good. 90
we'll
minutes.
see if I can. We'll see if I can. If I don't know if I can match that kind of stamina. But who
Just to
knows? Maybe.
stay all the time you want. Just take the time
Okay.
it's on.
All right. Well, good. So rather than go right to the Thomas Aquinas stuff, um, if you, I don't know if you can use your little reaction emoji guide, but show of hands for people who are able to take a look at the kind of biographical reading. Was anybody able to look at that article there? Uh, okay, maybe two-thirds or so. All right. Uh, good deal. Um, so I'll reiterate a little bit of that, and then I'm curious if y'all have kind of high level questions about Lonergan's biography, where he fits in 20th century thought, things like that. Let me see if I can. Can I convince you to go watch your tablet again for a little while? No. You're having a great time just coughing in my lap while I try and do this. Oh, okay, great. Um, so Lonergan is born in a English and Irish Catholic enclave in a place called Buckingham in Quebec in Canada. His dad was a surveyor. Every once in a while, maps and map making will show up as examples in Lonergan's writings, and I didn't realize until recently that that is almost certainly a oblique reference to his father. And his mother was, by all accounts, something of a saintly woman, very very devout. And it was pretty obvious pretty early that Lonergan was intellectually gifted. Um, okay, you go snuggle with Millie. And he got a reputation even among sort of his Jesuit novice fellows for being a brain. He was teased, I think, for being kind of antisocial. He wanted to sit in his room and read and write and think. And it wasn't too long before his Jesuit superiors took note, and they ended up well, first he went and did his undergraduate studies at Haythrop, and while he was at Haythrop College, which is now defunct, unfortunately. Sorry, hold on just a second. While he was in while he was in London, he took outside degrees at the same time in classics and mathematics. Bill Matthews was sort of Lonergan's primary intellectual biographer. He records that Lonergan had wanted to do sort of major in methodology, and his advisors suggested he would be better off doing languages, classics, and mathematics. Um, and Lonergan ended up being sort of grateful for that. He realized he really wasn't ready to take on the methodical questions, but he was interested in them from an early stage. He says in Matthew's book, um, he says, he quotes Lonergan as saying, both in philosophy and in theology, I wanted to know what in the world they were doing. And so that's going to be a kind of recurring question, is thinking about uh, not thinking just about philosophy and theology in terms of a content, but in terms of a set of activities. What are the contents are the product of the activities that people do. So what are those people up to? And how does the shape or the contours of the character of the activity shape the contours of the content? Um, if you're of a phenomenological mindset, you might notice here the kind of correlation of noesis and noema, things like that. Um, but so Lonergan goes home after he's finished his undergraduate studies, goes back to Canada, and he gets back to Canada right as the Depression hits. And I think in Canada alone there were like 200,000 people unemployed or something in 1930. And Lonergan had already been inducted into an interest in economics as a field of study by one of his teachers. I was reading the other day, Fred Lawrence. Lonergan has here. I've got all my books here. Hold on a second. Um, Lonergan ultimately wrote two pretty lengthy essays in macroeconomic analysis, which are now both published in the collected works. If I can do that so there's not a glare. One of them he wrote in the 40s, and the other one he picked it up again at the end of his life. But Lonergan, as an undergraduate student, was really scandalized by the way in which English politicians invoked the putatively iron laws of supply and demand to not intervene in the Irish famine. He got back to Canada and saw people putting forward policy responses to the depression that he knew were going to be inflationary, but he couldn't articulate why. So he sort of mathematically intuited that these policies would be inflationary, they'd make the problem worse, but he didn't have a theory of economics to be able to say why. Um, his readings of Hegel and his readings of Marx made him really interested in broader questions of the philosophy of history, and his interest in economics was kind of part and parcel of his interest in the philosophy of history as well. So Lonergan gets mostly held up as, hold on a second, baby. Okay, do you think you could do them upstairs? No, you don't think so? Okay, well, I just don't want it to be loud because folks are trying to listen, baby. Yeah. Um, let's see, where was I? So, one of the things that is, Lonergan often, if, a number of you said I kind of know Lonergan's name or I bumped into Lonergan a little bit. I don't really know anything about him. You're in the good company of most everybody. There was a kind of a moment in Anglophone theology where it looked like Lonergan might be a kind of, um, for the really enraptured people thought of like this guy's going to be a kind of new Thomas Aquinas or something. I think after the council in Catholic theology, there was a tendency uh, well, we've been sort of liberated from the dominance of Thomist thought. Now, who's going to be this sort of new modern master we fit ourselves under? And then it's like, well, is it Rahner or is it Balthazar or is it Lonergan or these other guys? Um, that didn't, I don't think, lasted very long. But there was a certain tendency for a while. Lonergan gets written up in Time magazine at one point, but mostly when people think about him, they think about him in terms of things like epistemology and theological method. Um, and the thing that I think Lonergan thought of himself as working on was the philosophy of history. Um, and my teacher, Robert Dorn, was somebody for whom those were the questions that fascinated him and that drew him to Lonergan as well. Um, so anyway, those his experience of the Depression was informative of that. And then, 4 years later, he get in 33 or 34, he's a part of the first class of Jesuits from the Canadian province to get sent to the Gregorian. I think there were five or six of them, and he gets sent to Rome in the 30s. He gets sent to the Rome and Italy of Mussolini. At one point, he's across the street when Hitler's car pulls up to come visit Mussolini. Apparently, he and his close friend would use sort of code names to talk about Hitler and Mussolini in casual conversation. Um, there were a couple summers where Lonergan went to the German Jesuit house to go study get his German kind of buffed up, and he acknowledged to his superior that, like, I hope it's okay I do this. I do have a tendency to kind of offend the German nationalists there. So Lonergan had a real encounter with both the collapse of the Great Depression, but he also had an up close and personal encounter with fascism. And in fact, in 38, Lonergan sets out on writing his doctoral thesis. His advisor is Louis Boyer. Boyer directs him to a question about grace, operative and cooperative grace, as sort of articulated initially by Augustine, but then received and repositioned by Aquinas. And he ends up writing on that. He writes his dissertation in about 17 months, clearly hurrying because he knows the war is ramping up at the end of the 1930s. And he's scheduled to defend in mid-May of 1940. And 2 days before his defense, his Jesuit superiors put him on a boat out of Genoa back to Canada because it's becoming clear that Lonergan, Canadian, um, subject to the British Crown, he's gonna have to hide out in the Vatican for the duration of the war if he stays. So they hustled him back to Canada, and the poor guy wouldn't ultimately defend and get his doctorate for another 3 or 4 years, which also stymied his original plan, which was to become a professor at the Gregorian. So went back and he taught at a seminary in Quebec for a stretch, and it really wasn't until the 1950s that Lonergan would finally end up at the Gregorian. In the interim, he continued to do more work on Aquinas. You're hungry. Why don't you go grab a snack out of the snack drawer? Um, he did, he says he spent 11 years reaching up to the mind of Thomas Aquinas, that he really didn't become interested in Aquinas till he had to write his doctorate on him. And before that, as the article notes, Lonergan had found a kind of intellectual mentor in Newman. He'd been interested in a certain kind of Platonism through this guy Stewart's book on Plato. Okay, fine, go ahead. Actually, I have to get them for you. Give me just 1 second. Let me get this kid some goldfish crackers. Um, so he both writes his doctoral thesis on Thomas on Grace and Freedom, which he then reworks for the newly started journal Theological Studies, the Jesuit Theological Journal Theological Studies, which had started in 1940. Um, he reworks his doctoral dissertation as a series of articles in that, and then from there he moves on to write a series of articles on the question of the verbum mentis, what ends up getting called the inner word in Aquinas, because he thinks that in kind of common theological opinion at the time, folks are misunderstanding the Thomas's analogy from the inner word to procession in God. And so those articles are both about Thomas's epistemology, but they're also about the link between the human mind and the divine nature. And so again, it's one of those things where uh, there can be a tendency, and I think this is where some of the kind of uh, pejorative accusations of Kantianism get applied. There can be a tendency to think that Lonergan worked out an epistemology and then is trying to sort of press his theology through the sieve of his epistemology. And for Lonergan, the epistemological questions are secondary, even tertiary. Um, the primary questions in philosophy are about philosophy of history, and the primary questions in theology are questions about Trinitarian thought and about Christology. And he's turned to these epistemological questions both by his investigation of the philosophy of history, but also by his dissatisfaction with the state of theological questions in the 1940s and into the 50s. He then goes. He ends up going to the Gregorian. At the Gregorian, he's tasked with teaching in alternate. I can't remember if it's alternate semesters or alternate years, Christology and Trinity. At the time, in the 1950s, the Gregorian, everything's taught in Latin. He writes textbooks to use in these courses that are also written in Latin. In the collected works we have, I'm going to grab them again. We have these really quite marvelous editions now where it's facing pages, Latin and English. Um, this is the one of his Trinitarian theology textbooks. There's also De Verbo Incarnato, and a couple other things he wrote for his Christology course that we have as well. Uh, I skipped over things. He wrote some stuff as well. He wrote what he called supplementary textbooks when he was still in Canada before he went to Rome to teach. And the sort of funny story is, if you're interested in sort of grace and nature stuff or grace questions generally, for those of you who are David Hart aficionados or Milbank or other people for whom that's an animating discussion, Lonergan was teaching a course on grace and discovered a couple weeks into the class apparently that he didn't like the received textbook he was handed to teach the class, and so he canceled class for a couple weeks and wrote a supplementary textbook in Latin. And we have those as well, Dante Supernaturale. He also wrote a text that's called in English it's The Knowledge and Will of God. That's also a very interesting text. Um, So there's a whole bunch of stuff. So people have bumped into Lonergan's sort of English language works, Insight, Method and Theology, his various essay collections. But there's a whole bunch of stuff he wrote in Latin as textbooks for classes, which is much more directly and overtly theological. Um, Also more dominantly Thomist because it's, pre-Vatican II context. Uh, and that stuff just isn't read. As much as Lonergan's English language works are a kind of boutique interest for in a lot of people's eyes, his Latin language stuff is just read by almost nobody. And it's a shame because it's full of really interesting stuff. As a biographical note about me, I was mostly a phenomenology and hermeneutics guy when I started out in philosophy, and I was still kind of thinking in those terms when I ultimately changed disciplines and went into theology. But it was Robert Dorn who put these Latin language texts in front of me, and the idiom is very daunting. It's this old kind of scholastic thing of you'll have terms defined, and the terms are put together into theses, and the theses are arranged into syllogisms, and then you have expositions of the syllogism, and it's forbidding if you're not used to the sort of idiom of these scholastic textbooks. But buried in it is some really top tier thinking and some overlooked solutions to some rather serious theological problems, some stubborn theological problems. And I actually ended up writing my dissertation, which is now, if you'll forgive a little bit of log rolling, now a book from Catholic Theological or Catholic University of America Press. The ambiguity of being. A big chunk of this is bringing Lonergan's Latin language theology of divine action and divine knowledge and divine will into the debates over the natural and supernatural. If you're interested in this, I apologize for how expensive it is, but that's academic monograph economics at work. So Lonergan goes to the Greg. He's there, give or take, for about 10 years. He's there for the first few sessions of the Second Vatican Council. He would leave Rome in the summers, like everybody leaves Rome in the summer, and go visit his brother. Greg was at St. Mary's University in Halifax. Um, in fact, in one summer, he gave a series of lectures. I think it was in '58. He gave a series of lectures that are now collected as Understanding in Being, which is a pretty good guide to insight, actually. If insight is too daunting, the Understanding in Being lectures are very helpful. Um, but in 1965, Lonergan goes in for a kind of regular checkup, and they discover he's got lung cancer in his, I think, left lung. And pretty quickly, they decide they're going to do surgery. They take his lung out, and the surgery is very invasive. And Bill Matthews has an article where he goes into they really almost killed him. The surgery was really serious, and he kind of just barely squeaked through. And Lonergan was a little bit heartbroken about this because he even though he made it through the surgery, he came out of it in a lot of pain. And because of a kind of by the way remark made by I think a doctor or a nurse or something, he was fairly convinced he only had about 5 more years to live. This is in 1965. And he had just made this big intellectual breakthrough about theological method, sort of a modern theological method, something that we'll talk about towards the end of the course, what he called functional specialization. And he wanted to write a book about it, but he was worried that A, he wouldn't have enough years, and even in the years he did have, that he'd be too much pain and too sick to pull it off. It would turn out that he recovered enough, and Regis College at University of Toronto gave him just a research professorship to be able to just work on the thing. So by 1972, Method in Theology is published. Um, in the late 60s, Lonergan gave a number of occasional talks, kind of priming the pump for the problematic that Method in Theology is going to turn out to answer. We're going to read 3 or 4 of those essays as a part of this course. In a lot of ways, I'm thinking about what we're doing here as uh, meditating on the problem that Method in Theology would answer. We're going to get a little taste and flavor of the answer in our very last meeting. Um, but uh, but one of the difficulties with Lonergan, I think, is if you pick up Method in Theology and you just start reading it, um, partly because Lonergan thought he was going to die, he doesn't he doesn't spill a lot of ink explaining to you why this new modern method in theology that he's devised is needful. And so my hope is that in the course of this course, you'll walk away with a robust sense of what the problem is. That if you then go read Method in Theology, Lonergan is presenting a solution to. Um, So Method in Theology comes out in '72. Lonergan spends a year at Harvard. He leaves Regis, he goes to Harvard for a year, and then he sort of spends his quasi-retirement at Boston College, which is partly part of why there's a Lonergan Research Institute at Regis in Toronto, and then there's also a Lonergan Institute at Boston College. And then there's a kind of a Lonergan thing at Marquette because of Bob Doran. And the Lonergan Institute here at Seton Hall is because of one of Lonergan's students at the Gregorian named Monsignor Richard Liddy. Um, but Lonergan spends his last productive decade or so at Boston College, and something that's interesting is that Lonergan was at a meeting. I was actually, if you follow me on now Blue Sky, I was talking about this the other day. Um, Lonergan uh, was at a meeting at Notre Dame with Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologian. And I don't know exactly the context of the remarks, but Gutierrez apparently made some comment about how one of the limitations of Latin American liberation theology at the time was that people were quite theologically and philosophically sophisticated and morally sensitive, but they didn't really know any economic theory. And Lonergan took this as an occasion to blow the dust off of his work he had done in the 1940s on economic theory and pick it up again and try and make a contribution to economic theory in a way that was informed by Catholic social teaching. And I think, if I remember it correctly, I think that's this volume for a new political economy that he was able to finish. Um, Lonergan spends the last stretch of his life at the Jesuit Infirmary in Pickering, Ontario, and he died there in 1984. So he had a lot more than 5 years left, despite what he thought, and he was able to get quite a lot done. I think there were people who were disappointed that Lonergan, at the end of his life, returned to the economic theory instead of maybe going back and doing a kind of a more modern, less scholastic Christology or Trinitarian theology or something like that. Um, but more and more, I used to think of Lonergan's economics works as being a kind of self-indulgent kind of side project, like a hobby. Um, and more, I see it really as, and I think he did too, saw it as integral with his interest in the philosophy of history, of how do you make historical situations improve instead of deteriorate. Um, and and so that's what he spent his a big chunk of his seventh decade working on. Um, what else? What else perhaps is there to say? Well, good. I've been talking a long time. Why don't I stop there? Do folks? Oh, I was gonna. This is the other thing I was gonna say. It is kind of interesting that Lonergan and Karl Rahner have the same birth and death years, um, but interacted, as far as I can tell, almost not at all. I was listening to somebody the other day talking about Lonergan, and they reported an anecdote that apparently there was one occasion in which Karl Rahner, and Bernard Lonergan attempted to talk shop, and it ended with Lonergan taking offense and storming out of the room. So apparently it didn't go very well. Uh, I don't know what the topic of the conversation was, but anyway, yeah. So, but yeah, any any questions about Lonergan's biography, about stuff from the that Church Life Journal piece I had you look at, stuff I said? I'd be curious if there's anything you want me to zoom in on or other context that might be helpful.
I was curious in the article, it talked about he had an essay on marriage and it was rejected and they told him it like was contrary to church teaching and it really hurt his feelings. I was curious what that was all about.
Yeah, let me hold on just one second. I think it's in. I'm trying to remember which volume it's in. Yeah, Finality, Love, and Marriage. Now, what is a little bit funny is that so part of what Lonergan's doing in Finality, Love, and Marriage is he's trying to make an argument, a pretty sophisticated argument for he's pretty young at the time. I think it was from like 1927 or something. And he's trying to make an argument about marriage as hold on, let me my daughter has just flipped on the television. Give me just one second. Hold that thought. All right, appreciate your patience. So part of what Lonergan's doing is he's trying to talk about marriage as he's doing it teleologically. So he's still well within the bounds of a kind of classic natural law thinking about marriage. Um, and it's still well within again sort of classic natural law thinking in terms of uh, um, being ordered to procreation and things like that. But part of what Lonergan's doing is developing the way in which um, marriage has multiple ends, right? So it's teleological, but it's not a kind of he wants to expand the sense in which it's teleological. And so it both has an end, a kind of proximate teleology towards reproduction, but it also has a further end in terms of the union of the married couple, right? That marriage is also for the union of these two souls. And then beyond that, it has a further telos, a further end in terms of the union of these two souls with God. And so he's trying to give a more sophisticated, dynamic model of the teleology of marriage. And again, 1920s. And I don't know a lot of the ins and outs of the politics of the thing, but apparently this was seen as sort of diluting the diluting the teaching of the church on marriage, um, and its ordering towards reproduction. Uh, and Lonergan was kind of an interesting guy. I find him an interesting figure in this regard that Lonergan would often have to be careful because he was on the one hand, I think, quite quite uh, quite theologically conservative himself in terms of church teaching and things like that, but also intellectually quite courageous. Um, and so there was a tendency, I think, for people to sort of misread him in either direction. So hold on, my 4-year-old's yelling at me again. Just a second. Okay. Um, so anyway, yeah, so that's sort of the story there. I was trying to figure out which volume Finality 11 Marriage is in, but it's apparently not this one I've picked up here.
I think it's in collection.
It's in what?
Collection.
It's in collection, okay. So Lonergan Lonergan students would sometimes round up his occasional essays and want to publish them. And they put them together and they asked Lonergan what he wanted to call it. And the thing he came up with was collection. And then when other students rounded up more essays and wanted to release another collection of essays, they said, "Well, what should we call it?" And he said, "Call it a second collection." And then when they came up with more essays to put together into a volume, they said, "What should we call it?" And he said, "Call it a third collection." So you can see how Lonergan, whatever his other many gifts, I don't know that he had much of a marketing mind. Uh, but so anyway, yeah. But that's a good question. Um, any others? Other things in that essay or in the stuff I said that caught your eye you want more detail on?
Could I dovetail with that question?
Yeah, please.
So I think I remember in Jeremy Wilkins' Before Truth, he sort of alluded to around the time that Humanae Vitae was published, there being a story to be told there. And I was like, oh, I wonder what that story is. So
Yeah. Let me see. I don't know if I have that. volume of method. Um, so Lonergan was I was noticing this the other day that there's I hadn't realized I was sort of prepping for this and I hadn't realized that Lonergan, in addition to all of his writing, his sort of scholarly writing, he would also like write book reviews for local newspapers and things like this. And he kept a pretty serious correspondence, of which we have a lot in the archives. Um, and One of the things that we have extent is someone sent Lonergan a letter asking about sort of his opinion of Humanae Vitae, and I got my 4-year-old settled, and now my dog is like trying to climb into my lap. I'm gonna put you in your crate, dog. Um, Come on, come on. Yeah, you get to go in there. Uh, yeah, somebody sent Lonergan. If you don't know, Humanae Vitae was the around the same time as the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican document that really put a hard line down about the use of contraception uh, for the Catholic Church, and somebody wrote to Lonergan asking him about it, and he wrote them a letter that was a private correspondence, which he said, I think if I remember correctly in the letter, he says this isn't, don't share this with anybody, because he didn't feel impelled to weigh in on the controversy. It was very controversial. If you know any of the story of like Charlie Curran and a couple other people at CUA, there was a lot of Sturm and Drang. And Lonergan didn't evidently wasn't interested in weighing in, but he did write in this letter basically his own dissatisfaction with Humanae Vitae was not that he thought that the document came to the wrong conclusion as to the moral licitness of the use of contraception, but his frustration with it is that it gave its explanation for the for that position in terms of Aristotelian biology. Um, and so, Lonergan said the account that's given is just simply factually wrong in terms of what we know about biology now. And so, one of the things we're going to talk about, in fact, especially when we read the kind of introductory chapter of Lonergan's Trinitarian textbook, that Lonergan makes a strong distinction between uh, the teaching is promulgated under the authority of the church and the speculative apparatus that's used to help us to understand what it is God is communicating to us through the teaching of the church. And so for Lonergan, Lonergan didn't find any problem with saying, I assent to the church's judgment about this moral teaching, but to still at the same time to criticize, yeah, but the speculative apparatus that's being used to explain that teaching is just not sufficient for what we know as modern people. Um, and so now, as you might imagine, this now in the early '90s, my teacher Robert Doran uh, had I don't know exactly the arrangement with the estate, but evidently had the authority to decide to publish that letter. And so it's since been published in, I think, a volume of Method Journal of Lonergan Studies, maybe. So you can find that the letter's been published. You can find it and read it for yourself. But that's basically the upshot. And interestingly, one of the things that Lonergan appeals to is the modern significance of statistical intelligibility in human reproduction. So anyway, I won't go way too far into that because it gets to be a lot really fast. But yeah, but that's the basic gist there. And it's relevant to what we're talking about in this course, right? Is that Lonergan really thought that you could make this hard distinction between uh, what the church teaches and its kind of magisterial authority, and then the sort of uh, the speculative effort to understand what the church teaches, which is going to be on the move and is going to be kind of part and parcel with the development of with the intellectual development of various cultures in various times in different places. Um, Now, what ends up sort of happening is uh, because everything apparently has to get pressed through the frame of culture war fights. It ends up being that progressive Catholics say that Lonergan was being cagey and that actually he disagreed with the teaching, but he was hedging his bets. And then you have conserv conservatives pointing to this as evidence that Lonergan can't be trusted because see, he dissented from Humanae Vitae, which if you read the letter isn't what he did, but nevertheless, right, these things do get pressed through those filters. Good. I don't know. Did that answer your question? I sort of felt
Yeah,
like
thank you. No, that was helpful. I appreciate it.
good. Other questions about the biographical stuff or things from the essay?
I had a question about his economic research.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's like anybody that's like taken up the mantle of his economic research paradigm or like written about it, or is it kind of just something that's been forgotten about?
Um, Good. Oh, and there's a question in the chat too, so I'll get to that in just a second. Yes. Periodically people have taken it up. So when they published his essay from the 40s, Fred Lawrence at Boston College wrote a big, long introductory essay that's very helpful in situating Lonergan. It kind of goes through and talks about Lonergan's relationship to the various sources in economic thought that he engaged with, Keynes and others. Um, and then, oh, I'm forgetting his name. Paul St. Amour, maybe? Anyway, there was a guy who wrote a series of articles about Lonergan's economics in the early 2000s. I'll look that up and I can get it for you if you're interested. And in fact, at about 10 years ago now, uh, the Seton Hall Lonergan Institute, long before I ever got here, did a series of colloquia on it as well. There there's some limitations to it. I mean, one of the Lonergan was very interested in the function of finance in the economy, um, but the global economy has become so financialized and financialized in such a baroque fashion in the intervening decades that I sort of wonder if Lonergan's analysis would just simply be out of date at this point. If it's still too anchored to a kind of old global industrialized economy model. Um, Lonergan really liked Schumpeter, and I think relied a lot and sort of stood on Schumpeter's shoulders quite a bit. He's very critical of Keynes. Um, he he had a kind of intuition that modern economics was too interested in the question of price setting. He thought that was a kind of distraction. I think that had to do with why he liked Schumpeter better. But yeah, it's his approach is idiosyncratic in a couple of ways. On one level, it's idiosyncratic just because if any of you have read Lonergan at all, you know that his sort of own voice, he has a kind of idiosyncratic literary voice. Uh, and so Lonergan is sort of idiosyncratic in any field he writes in for that reason. But also Lonergan's idiosyncratic in that Fred Lawrence, in fact, quotes an economist that he had sort of given Lonergan's economic writings to. And the economist sort of said, "This isn't like anything else I've read." And that guy pointed to that part of the reason that Lonergan's approach was idiosyncratic was because Lonergan's concerns were so anchored in Catholic social teaching, and that sort of the ends to which he was writing were different than the broader economic conversation. Now, I I think Lonergan probably would have recognized that himself. Lonergan later in his career would would say, one of the difficulties is okay, on the one hand, you can have Catholic theologians who are making extrinsic critiques of the economy. And they can do what Catholic social teaching has done, which is say, enterprises need to pay a living wage or a family wage. Rerum Novarum does that, a couple others. Uh, but if you have an economic arrangement in which any enterprise that actually pays a family wage will go out of business, well, it doesn't make any difference. Um, and so he thought it was really important that Catholic thinkers engage not just in the extrinsic critique of saying what the ideal ought to be, but also to engage in intrinsic critique, which is to say to enter into the discourse of economists and with the advantage of uh, sort of both doing the heavy lifting to get up to speed with what economists are doing, but also with the advantage of having a kind of outsider's view, try to inject new ideas that might help realize an economy in which enterprises could pay a living wage and stay in business. Um, and on the one hand, right, that does have the advantage of, yeah, from the outside, you might see stuff that people who are pressed up against economic theory might not see. On the other hand, it might mean that when you hand them your stuff, they go, "What's this?" Right? This isn't what we do. And I think that mostly has been the way Lonergan's economic writings have been received. And even people who are Lonergan specialists like me, partly because it's highly mathematized and in undergrad I took math for liberal arts majors and I got my B minus and I got out of there. So for me, when I start seeing mathematical symbols, I have to resist the urge to have my eyes glaze over. And so even among Lonergan scholars who are sort of many of us sort of literary types, um, we can sort of excuse ourselves from having to master it because we go, oh yeah, that was Lonergan's kind of side hobby thing. Um, and like I said, I have recently sort of realized I think actually that's a mistake. I think his economic thinking is much more integrated into his overall project um, than than I certainly had appreciated previously. But yeah, I think it's Paul Saint Amour is the guy who wrote the article. But if you're interested in that, I'll dig it up and I'll send it to you. Send me a message in Canvas and um, I'll make sure to dig that article up for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, sorry. There was a question in the chat. Kyle asked, did Lonergan ever engage with the works or perhaps cross paths with Francophone Catholic thinkers like Blondel, Sertillange, or Gilson? Yes. Uh, Evidently, Lonergan read like everything. Um, Part of the reason he got we have this letter that Lonergan wrote to his superior, and it opens with him saying, look, if you want me to quit, I will, but I'm getting some momentum with these cigarettes, and if I'm going to keep smoking them, I'm going to need you to up my budget." And I think part of it is that Lonergan would stay up late and smoke cigarettes and read. Um, and uh, and so Lonergan was this voracious reader. He just read all kinds of stuff. And apparently he had this habit. I mean, if you're a student yourself, it'll make you feel guilty. Because apparently he would do summaries and outlines and he had this whole note keeping system and stuff. Um, and it's kind of wild because on the one hand, by the account of his students and his colleagues, he just read everything. Um, but when you pick up his books and you look at the footnotes, he's very selective about what he actually engages with. Um, he'll I was reading something in Insight the other day, and he picks out this book in from the 1950s on interpersonal psychiatry that he liked and sort of says, "Hey, everybody should read this." Um, but he didn't tend to engage in kind of, he didn't do literature reviews. He didn't have kind of long excurses engaging dialectically with um, people writing on similar topics in his day. He would sometimes, if he really liked something, he would summarize it. He would say, as so and so says in this book, and he'd cite the book and he'd give a little summary of it. And he'd say, that's great. I agree with that. Or if he disagreed with somebody, which he didn't often do in print, every once in a while he'd hold somebody up as having a kind of mistaken view and try to correct them. But he mostly eschewed that. Um, so yeah, so it's sort of funny. He was on the one hand this very widely read, um, and on the other, when you read his books, you might not necessarily get the sense that he's got this big library behind him. Um, I think early in his career, he's kind of dismissive of Blondel. He thinks of Blondel as being a kind of some kind of pragmatist. He in fact lists him with the pragmatists, and he doesn't think that that's. He think that there's a kind of anti-intellectualism to that he doesn't approve of. Later, he'll still include Blondel in a list with both pragmatists and also people like Kierkegaard, but much more affirmatively. He kind of will get the point a little more later on, especially after he's read his students are reading existentialists, and he picks them up and kind of gets what they're on about. Excuse me. Um, I'm trying to think about if I've seen him engage with Gilson, but I can't remember where. As I think I mentioned in my, I'm going to get a glass of water in just a second, but I think I mentioned in my podcast with Paul, Lonergan both appreciated what the Nouvelle ressourcement people were doing, but I think he was also a little bit critical of it because I think he still he felt like they weren't quite grasping the nettle of the problem of history in the way that uh, he thought it really needed to be addressed. I think he thought that they weren't quite seeing how they weren't quite expressing how challenging the problem of history could be for theology. All right. Sorry, that's probably not a terribly satisfactory answer, but it's the one that comes to mind. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go get some water so that I don't keep coughing into the microphone. Do y'all want to take like 4 or 5 minutes? We'll take a little break. You can stretch your legs or whatever, and then we'll spend a little while talking about Aquinas's um, the beginning of the Summa Theologiae. All right, sounds good. Cool. I'll be back in like 4 or 5 minutes.
Joshua,
Yes.
tell me what class do you teach?
I teach a range of classes. I teach history of the papacy, intro to early Christianity for graduate students, patristic doctrines of creation. I co-teach with a friend of mine who's an Old Testament scholar. We teach on the book of Hebrews. None
Oh,
of the New
really?
Testament people want to touch it. It's kind of in no man's land in New Testament scholarship, and so our joke is, I'm a patristics guy, he's Old Testament. So if you average us together, we are a New Testament scholar. So it works out very nicely.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Yeah, I'd like to know about your stuff on Hebrews.
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's a
Watch
great
out!
book.
Watch out! You'll end up teaching one of these classes
Yeah,
before you.
apparently I know. Yeah.
All right, I do want to get. I sort of cut us off kind of quickly there. Was there any residual questions about Lonergan's biography or anything like that? Anybody had on the tip of their tongue before we moved to Aquinas?
Super quick, did
Yeah.
Gustavo ever come back around? So he mentioned something to Lonergan. Did that loop ever close?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
And I unfortunately I didn't know about this connection until like right before Gutierrez died. So I can't even go and follow up, unfortunately, at least not in this life.
Thanks.
Add it to the list for the next, you know.
We all have our notebook, right?
Yeah, that's right. Good. Any other questions folks had on the biography piece? Okay, let's march ahead then. Let me see if I can quickly and easily. I was gonna share. Uh,
Jonathan, I may have to. I'll make you the host of the meeting.
okay, go ahead.
You
Yeah,
want to share a screen?
yeah. I was just gonna put the Summa PDF up, um, that I shared with everybody. Let me figure out the best way to do this here. That'll work.
I have to remember
Okay.
how to do this. You
It's
want to
okay.
share
Or
it?
you could put it up if you want. I mean,
No, I'd rather you do it because
okay.
I'm just uh, I got to remember how to do it.
I bet if you go to participants, uh,
Let's see.
you can click on me and
Let's see. Yes, here I got it. Okay, I'm going to make you host. When
right.
we leave, if you could make sure, or if I should forget, to turn that back over to me because then I can control the recording.
Good. Okay.
You're now the host.
All right, very good. So now I um let's see. Once upon a time I did everything in Zoom and I got really good at it. And then I came to a new university and they do everything on Teams and I'm mediocre at that and I've forgotten how Zoom works. Let's see. I got all these things here. Here, let me do this differently. What's this thing called? It's okay. I might have it now. Let's see. Let's try that. Uh, Okay. All right. I'm gonna have to, in order to share this, I'm gonna have to close Zoom and restart it, which I don't want to do. So, sorry, was that Paul? You're muted.
Do you want me to try to share it?
Why don't you go ahead and just pull it up and we'll do
Okay,
it.
I'm gonna take.
Do
Can
it like
you?
the old days with the TA with slides.
Okay, I'm gonna take the host over then,
Okay.
and now we're gonna see. Okay.
Turns out I didn't give my computer permission to show things in Zoom. So the reason we're looking at this thing from Aquinas is kind of twofold. Um, I mean, so one reason we're looking at this thing from Aquinas is Lonergan begins his theological career in a period in Catholicism where the document of Aeterni Patris is still kind of controlling theological discourse, and so the thought of Thomas Aquinas is going to be the be all and end all of Catholic thought, and it's on the genius of Thomas Aquinas. We're going to be able to address the myriad ills of modern life and modern thought. Aquinas, and one can still bump into this mentality all over the place that Aquinas is this kind of pristine expression of the philosophy perennis, and Lonergan would sometimes sort of tease the Thomism of his day as thinking that the eternal truths expressed by Thomas Aquinas were so true that they could get along without any human minds to know them. Um, and But nevertheless, even for Lonergan, his his theological formation is in a Thomist context. And when he's teaching theology, he's teaching in a context where he is expected to communicate to his students, the best of Aquinas's theological mind and philosophical mind. And as we'll see, there are certain core elements of the way that Thomas thinks about uh, theological method, about theology as, in Latin, a scientia, as a form of knowledge, as an ideal of knowledge, that will stick with Lonergan all the way through. Um, but it's a moving target. The significance of a certain set of core Thomist ideas about the relationship between philosophy and theology, about the relationship between theology and other human sciences, about what scientific knowledge even is. Um, this is something that's going to be on the move, and we're going to trace how for Lonergan his thinking about it and his expressions of it develop. So I thought it would be good to have some familiarity with what Thomas says, at least in the Summa. Hardly a kind of compendious approach to the thing, but at least what we might call a representative sample. So Paul, if you'd scroll down to the first question, would it be helpful? I don't know how familiar people are. Are people sort of familiar with the genre of the Summa in general, or of Thomas's Summa Theologiae in particular? Would it be a helpful thing for me to do a kind of précis on this genre? Paul, you're nodding. That'd be okay. So let me sip my tea. Excuse me. This is not my own account of this. This is Lonergan's own account of this. So this is how Lonergan came to think of this. Jesus's disciples at the Great Commission become authorized to teach what Jesus had to say, what Jesus had to teach, right? He says, "Go and make disciples of all nations," which is to say, you, my students, now go get students of your own. And so the The disciples get a new role and they get a new title and they become apostles. And they receive the Holy Spirit to empower them to be able to fulfill this role and to fulfill this task. And but there's this problem, which is the apostles keep getting killed. Not all of them, but the good most of them. And so now the people who are authorized directly from Jesus to share the gospel, they ain't here. And and so you have the development, and these things get complicated in sort of their historical particularity, but the basic idea is that part of ordination has to do with the sort of handing on of the authorization to teach in an authoritative way about what the gospel is. And so that's what you get bishops for. And but then there emerges eventually the problem of, well, what happens when the bishops start teaching different stuff about core ideas in this message? Well, then you have to get the bishops writing letters to each other and they're calling each other's names, um and if it happens to be also that, through, accidents of Constantine's biography, now internal divisions in Christianity become internal divisions in the empire. Well, now you've got a real problem on your hands. So let's get everybody together, and we're gonna have to hash this stuff out. And so you end up having councils. This is quick and dirty church history, right? Um, and at the councils, by and large, you get credos, you get statements of faith, but you also get anathemas, right? So you get positions that are affirmed, but also positions that get rejected. And so you have this kind of core. Different people hash this out in different terms, like grammar or deposit of faith, which become dogmatic. They become kind of non-negotiable. But also, right, in the course of the discourse around establishing these core doctrinal affirmations, you generate a whole genre of literature of theological discourse. And within that discourse, right, retrospectively, one's able to see that, yes, there are certain things which gain doctrinal, even dogmatic affirmation, but there's also a whole spectrum, there's a whole range in the discourse of things about which, like, reasonable people might differ, right? We agree that these certain things are true, right? That the Son and the Father are homoousios, for example, or that in the one person of Christ there are two natures at Chalcedon. But like exactly how that works, you're going to get a lot of different opinions, and you're going to get the profusion of theological writings. And as time goes on, you'll have people reflecting on the theological writings of their forebears. And so not only do you have the sort of linear multiplication of theological opinions, but you have this kind of billowing unfolding of theological opinion reflecting back on itself. This becomes too much to handle pretty quickly. It becomes challenging just to keep the physical text themselves intact. You have to have a whole kind of whole enterprise of people just scribally making copies of the text, let alone thinking about them. And so there comes to be books of what are called books of sentences, which is to say aggregations of theological statements on a variety of topics, organized by topic. And so one way in which theological education begins to happen at cathedral schools and the like is that you have to develop a certain familiarity with these books of sentences. And one way to show your familiarity with the books of sentences is to write commentaries on the books of sentences. So we have these very beautiful manuscripts where you have the the sort of compendium of theological claims aggregated and organized by topic, and then in the margins you have the commentary on it. It's sort of like it's a little bit like Talmud if you're familiar with that. Um, but now you have the problem again, right? So now you have the multiplication of commentaries on these books of sentences. And you got to keep up with, well, this guy's commentary says this and this guy's commentary says that, and it gets very unwieldy very quickly. there emerges another technique for engaging this, which is the quadlibetal disputation. And in the quadlibetal disputation, uh, one way of cutting through the billowing aggregation of theological opinion is to set philosophical and theological problems, get learned people together, and in an organized way, have them argue about, on the merits, what's the right answer to this theological or philosophical question. And they can invoke, because they, in their theological education, they've familiarized themselves with these books of sentences. They've read a number of different commentaries. They've probably written their own commentary on the sentences. They can pull up relevant authorities on the thing, but they also need to like give reasons why this authority applies. Why this authority should control, even though there's other authorities that disagree with it. Why their opponents, why somebody else's commentary on it misses the mark or the like. Um, Hold on, my 4-year-old's hollering at me again. So now you might she's demanding that I snuggle, which is a nice demand to be faced with. Um but you can see again immediately the problem that's going to arise, right? Aggregates of theological questions and aggregates of different opinions answering them. Let me see if I can appease her, excuse me. So we'll see if that worked. Probably not, but we'll try. Um so so what you see here, right? What you see in the Summa, I am sorry, hold on. We're gonna see if Nintendo will solve our problems. Um, so what you have here in the Summa, and forgive me if this is really basic for people who are familiar with this, but in the Summa, what you have is yes, baby, what? Okay, you got it. Here you go. Can I have this, please? All right, one more time. The the basic structure of the articles in the Summa are structured like a quadlibetal disputation. So you start with a question, right? Whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. And then you have, and this is the way that the medieval classroom was structured. You'd have somebody who would voice a common opinion on the matter. So you have the first objections. We scroll down a little bit, Paul. And one has to kind of get used to this the structure of the thing. So you get the voicing of what are called objections, but are just kind of common opinions on the matter that are going to be at odds with what the author or the teacher is ultimately going to put forward. You get the said contra or the on the contrary, which is usually an appeal. It's a residue of the book's sentences. So you have an appeal to some authoritative text usually. Not always. We'll notice in here there's some times where there's a said contra with no authoritative text invoked. Yes, baby. I I can't really help you. All right, there you go. So excuse me. So then after invoking this authoritative text, then you have what's called the respondeo or the I answer that, which really sets out in brief the teacher or the author's own view on the question. And then you get replies to the objections, right? Which is not only can I answer this question adequately on my own terms and in accord with this authoritative text I've invoked, but also, in addition to that, I have adequate intellectual resources to defend my position against these other common opinions that are at odds with it. So the Summa contains this, Thomas's Summa or the works of Albertus Magnus or something, Albert the Great. It contains all these different articles that are all structured around the quadlibral disputation. But for Lonergan, Lonergan sees these sume as having an advance even beyond that, because you're still going to get the multiplication of these various questions. So then, what Lonergan thinks Thomas was able to do under the influence of his teacher Albert the Great, and then other medieval thinkers as well, is to attempt to organize the questions in a sapiential, in a wisdom-based way. So in part, this is pedagogical. Lonergan we'll see in the thing from his Trinitarian textbook that he thinks partly this has to do with what is kind of most intellectually basic. So, as the what's going to be kind of the most basic question that you could have, and then what are going to be the various complicating questions that would emerge from that down the line. In the part of the Summa that's about the Trinity, for example, the opening question that Thomas leads with is there procession in God? Because it's actually kind of difficult. It's a difficult question to figure out how in an infinite, eternal, and unchanging being there could be any kind of process. And so if there can't be process in God, if there can't be procession in God, then none of the rest of the stuff about the Son proceeding from the Father or the Spirit proceeding from the Father and the Son, none of that's going to matter. So we have to establish first that there can be procession, there can be process in God, and how. What's up, baby? Oh, I'm sorry, honey. I'm too loud. I'm being informed. Um, And so, and so the kind of intellectual technology of the Summa is to control this aggregation, this profusion of intellectual questions and all the possible answers to it, and the discourse that proceeds to try to answer it, and to try to organize it in a way that's going to follow what Lonergan will refer to in the medieval idiom as the via doctrina, the way of teaching. I know my dog's giving me trouble. I'm hoping next week things are easier on me because this is just ridiculous. Okay. So something to notice here is that for Thomas is not coming to this initial question out of nowhere. And something that's really interesting to me is that while yes, there's an intra-Christian debate about whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required, in some ways also this debate that Thomas is opening his Summa with is one that he's inheriting from the Muslim thinkers newly on the scene at the University of Paris. This is the kind of question that Al-Ghazali takes up. Averroes responds to Al-Ghazali, among others, with an opposed view on the sort of basicness of philosophy as opposed to theological doctrine. Now, in Islam, theological doctrine primarily means Quran. Um, in Maimonides, one sees a Jewish version of this that's also influential for Thomas. And so, I think it's important for as much as Aquinas is held up as the paradigmatically Christian, but specifically Catholic thinker for this long stretch from the 19th century deep into the 20th century, it's important to notice that Aquinas's position on these things is always already an interfaith uh, approach that he's engaged with and dialoguing with not just previous Christian thinkers, but also Muslim and Jewish thinkers. Um, so anyway, that's just kind of an important thing to notice. That's not going to be obvious right on the face of the text, but if you've ever read or encountered especially those Muslim texts, it becomes pretty obvious, pretty straight out of the gate. Um, okay, so why don't we zoom in for a minute? And one of the things that I want to notice is, Paul, will you go to the second article, please? So Thomas is going to establish straight out of the gate that, look, there's there is this thing called philosophy, which human reason generates on its own, but there's also this further thing of sacred teaching, right? There's philosophical teaching that human reason generates for itself, but we also need revealed teachings. Okay, so then there's this question, and it's kind of a strange question, if you don't know what Thomas means, whether sacred doctrine is a science. So the Latin term here, scientia, is a kind of rough translation of theoria, and really what we have operating is a logical, what Lonergan calls a logical ideal of science. And what that means is, oh, okay, baby, I'll come play in a little bit. Why don't you change it to one player and I'll come play later. Oh, okay. Um, so for example, right here in the first objection, it seems that sacred doctrine is not a science. Why? Well, science proceeds from self-evident principles. Okay, so we're clearly not dealing with the modern ideal of science, right? We're not dealing with natural science, a methodical science like the modern natural sciences of chemistry or biology or something. The ideal of science here is, well, in the first place, something that proceeds from self-evident principles. And the objection here is sacred doctrine proceeds from articles of faith, which are not self-evident. Their truth is not admitted by all, for not all men have faith, and we get a biblical warrant for that. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a science. This, this, by the way, this is Al-Ghazali's objection to Kalam, to sort of theological apologetics, is he goes, look, people just aren't really going to find quasi-philosophical reasoning from, excerpts from the Quran convincing, because they don't begin from self-evident principles. They begin from these articles, articles of faith that not everybody admits are true. So, the respect in which you can call this science is pretty iffy. All right, so objection 2. Further, no science deals with individual facts, but the sacred science treats of individual facts such as the deeds of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the like. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not science. So notice something else here, right? It's not just that you have self-evident first principles, but it's also that scientific knowledge really pertains to that which is certain, that which is universal, that which is necessary. Right? You're gonna deal in things like definitions, and so because sacred teaching has all kinds of stuff in it, like all kinds of historical narratives and things like that. Well, clearly it's not scientific according to this classical ideal, this logical ideal of science. All right. Now, interestingly, so then we get in the sed contra, we have an appeal to, right? We have a residue of the books of sentences. We have an appeal to Augustine's De Trinitate. To this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened. But this can be said of no science except sacred doctrine, right? No, there's no other sort of department of knowledge whereby you're going to get saving faith, begotten, nourished, protected, and strengthened. Therefore, sacred doctrine is a science. And then we're going to get Thomas's own position on the matter. Sacred doctrine is a science. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known to the natural light of intelligence, such as arithmetic or geometry or the like. There are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science, such as the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry, and music from principles established by arithmetic. So it is that sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from principles established by the light of a higher science, a higher knowledge, namely the science, the knowledge of God and the blessed, God and the saints. Hence, just as the musician accepts on authority the principles taught to him by the mathematician, so sacred science is established on principles revealed by God. So, this is an interesting little move he's making. He's going to say there's a respect in which theology is a subordinate science. It's subordinated the way that music is subordinated to math. But the thing it's subordinated to is God's own knowledge. When I'm done, sweetie, you play your video game and I'm going to keep talking about this, okay? Um, so, uh, yeah, we're going to go, baby. Don't let me finish doing this and then we can go. Um, so this puts us in an interesting position, which is the first principles of theology as a science for Thomas are not self-evident first principles the way that the philosophical ideal of science would be. Right? The philosophical idea is you get to something like the principle of non-contradiction, which can't be denied. It's self-evident. It has to be true, or nothing's true. Um, and so then you can kind of logically, deductively reason from there. Instead, what you're going to have is much like the musician just accepts on authority what the mathematician says about arithmetic ratios, for example. So too then, theology is going to receive its first principles from God's knowledge by revelation. And so the idea, so at the very core of theology, at the very heart of theology is accepting on authority the first principles from which you're gonna reason. Yes, honey. No. You can watch it upstairs. Go ahead, go upstairs. That's fine. I don't know. Um, so then, okay, where was I? So this is something that we're going to see uh we're going to see this continue with Lonergan early on in his approach to theological method, that that particularly speculative theology, sort of, or what today we might call sort of systematic theology, um, is going to be a subordinate science, and it's going to be subordinate to the teachings of magisterial authority, of revealed dogmatic truths. And so the way Lonergan's going to think about speculative theology, about systematic theology, is that the things we do not argue about are what the doctrines are. Now, if you're Catholic, that's easy because we have people who argue about what the doctrines are. They're called bishops. Not my job. And something to notice too is that even in a pre-Vatican II context where there are very few lay theologians in a Catholic context, still you have enough differentiation, even at the time of Aquinas, that the theological task has become an academic one, and the bishops have a different administrative task and a teaching task. And so you just no longer have this patristic situation where theologians are also bishops. You have a differentiation of the intellectual task where, yeah, the bishops are going to tell you what the doctrines are, and then the theologians, on the basis of accepting those doctrines as true, can argue about how to best understand them. Lonergan's going to really accept this for a long time. He's really going to sort of rest on this idea that the theological task is not to argue about what the doctrines are. The theological task is to assent to the truth of the doctrines and then try to figure out how do they cohere, how do we understand them, how do they make sense, what do they mean, that kind of thing. My dog is chewing on my hand. Now, if you're not in a Catholic context, that's a less satisfying answer. Speaking biographically, but for myself, there is a certain respect in which, having been a Protestant and becoming a Catholic, there is a certain appeal to it. One of the things I joke about is that not enough Catholic theologians enjoy how nice it is not being a bishop. That not having to be responsible for what it is the church teaches is an enormous weight to be relieved of. However, that being said, when me and Ryan Hemmer were in graduate school, we would take classes with D. Stephen Long, not to be confused with the Catholic theologian Stephen A. Long, but the Methodist theologian D. Stephen Long. And Ryan and I realized after a few classes with Steve that one of the confusions or one of the misunderstandings we endlessly had was that Steve tended to think of theological argument as being about figuring out how to articulate what it is the church teaches and which claims about church teaching are correct. And Ryan and I had been so Lonergan pilled, and we're both on our way to becoming Catholic, that we both were like, "That's not our job. That's just not what we. That's just not what we do." Now, later on, Lonergan is gonna integrate the affirmation of doctrines as a part of a historical scholarly task in a way that early on he doesn't. Early on, he eschews that, very much relying on Thomas's model here, and we'll see later on that he doesn't. And later on, he reconfigures how he thinks about that. So we'll be on the lookout for that as we go along. All right. I'm running out of time, so let me take about 10 more minutes and just look at a couple more salient things here in Thomas, and then I'll see if you have any questions, and then we'll wrap up. So, Paul, will you scroll down a little more here? We won't worry about the unity of sacred doctrine, and we won't worry about whether it's a practical science. Keep going. Uh, uh, da, 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 da. The nobility of it is kind of a boutique question as well. We can keep going. What was the thing I wanted to look at? Hold on just a second. Whether it's the same as wisdom. No, we don't have to worry about that. Go all the way down to Article 8. We'll jump to the end here. Here we go. All right. Whether sacred doctrine is a matter of argument. And scroll down to the respondio for me, would you? Just because this is just going to underline the point I was just making. There we go. All right. As other sciences do not argue in proof of their principles, right? You can't argue for the principle of non-contradiction. At least Aristotle doesn't think you can, right? Really just what, Aristotle says if someone denies the principle of non-contradiction, just get them to talk, he says. But rather they argue from their principles to demonstrate other truths in these sciences. So this doctrine, sacred doctrine, does not argue in proof of its principles, which are the articles of faith, but from them it goes on to prove something else, as the apostle from the resurrection of Christ argues in proof of the general resurrection. However, it is to be borne in mind, in regard to the philosophical sciences, that the inferior sciences neither prove their principles nor dispute with those who deny them, but leave this to a higher science, whereas the highest of them, metaphysics, can dispute with one who denies its principles, if only the opponent will make some concession. But if he concedes nothing, it can have no dispute with him, though it can answer his objections. In other words, which is just a rephrasing of Aristotle's point, for example, about the principle of non-contradiction. Hence, sacred scripture, since it has no science above itself, so this is interesting. Sacred scripture has no science above itself, can dispute with one who denies its principles only if the opponent admits some at least of the truths obtained through divine revelation. Thus, we can argue with heretics from texts in Holy Writ, and against those who deny one article of faith, we can argue from another. So if you're already in the tent as a person of faith in Christianity, but we disagree about this or that doctrine, well, we can get into an argument with one another. We can get into an argument with one another about, right, whether there was when he was not, or whether Christ has two wills, or whatever, right? But if our opponent believes nothing of divine revelation, there is no longer any means of proving the articles of faith by reasoning, but only of answering his objections, if he has any, against faith, right? So theology is going to be a science, but only for people who admit its first principles, which is to say, who assent to the truth of its articles of faith. You can't engage in theological argument if on this model, right? This kind of logical model, if the first principles aren't admitted. Since faith rests upon infallible truth, this is interesting. Faith rests upon infallible truth, and since the contrary of a truth can never be demonstrated, it is clear that the arguments brought against faith cannot be demonstrations, but are just difficulties that can be answered. That will be Lonergan will be very influenced by Newman's claim that 10,000 intellectual difficulties do not equal one doubt about one's faith. Okay. And then that's all right. I'll stop there because I'm running out of time here. But good. So I just wanted us to have some familiarity with the kind of core of Thomas's position about theological science and about this kind of logical ideal of science that thinks in terms of the universal, the necessary, that thinks in terms of certain first principles. It's interesting that Thomas thinks that the articles of faith are actually more certain than the self-evident first principles of philosophy, because human reason can err, but God can't make mistakes. And so that which is revealed is actually more certain than the self-evident principles of philosophy, which is an interesting claim. Anyway, I will stop there. I would love to hear questions, thoughts, clarifications you might need. And then in about probably 7 minutes, I'm going to have to turn into a pumpkin. So, but yeah, questions about the stuff in Thomas. So, good. Andrew asks, is this similar to the hermeneutic circle? Is that correct? And how are they different? Good. So that's a good connection to make. It's a connection that Fred Lawrence would make when he was going between being a student of Lonergan's and a student of Gadamer's. Um, uh, it is similar to the hermeneutic circle Lonergan thinks in this respect, that Lonergan thinks one's initial understanding of doctrine prior to doing theology uh, is what he calls a catechetical understanding. Um, and in fact, we'll read an article where he uses Athanasius to give a kind of example of a very basic, kind of minimal catechetical understanding of a doctrine. I do this with my students when we talk about the Trinity, right? Um, what is what is the divine nature? It's what there's one of in God. What are divine persons? It's what's there's three of in God. Right? What is the hypostatic union? It's two natures in one person. Now you might have a lot more questions than that, but as a catechetical matter, you just want to be able to sort of speak in a way that doesn't make basic kind of syntactical or grammatical mistakes. Um, and so, right, on the basis of that initial understanding, one does engage in uh, a kind of discursive process where one pivots between the parts, the particular doctrines, or the scriptural witness that backs them up, and then the whole, right? How do these things cohere into a holistic picture? And for the great so whether you're writing a summa and trying to proceed sapientially, or whether you're later writing a treatise, or even way later writing a systematic theology, right? You are, yeah, pivoting between the part and the whole. It's upsetting my dog, but I know, honey. So that's good. So and Lonergan will, it seems to me, sort of discover something proto-hermeneutical in this as hermeneutical philosophy comes on the scene and is running kind of parallel to what he's doing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So yeah, it's a good question. Other questions about this?
Coming at this from I've more experience with science in the modern sense, and I'm finding it very hard to distance myself and then interact with the meaning of science here. Can
Sure.
you help me understand? Like, he just uses it in too many different contexts that, in my schema, don't apply to the
Yeah,
words.
yeah. No, it's good. It's helpful at one level just to uh, so let's do it this way. Um, Science is to be distinguished from mere opinion, and what makes a kind of knowledge a scientific knowledge versus like just a kind of opinion is certitude. Um, and so if the word science is bumping you, one thing you can do is just in your head remind yourself that it's this Latin word scientia, and that what scientia means is knowledge as opposed to opinion. Um, and that the difference between knowledge as scientia and mere opinion is that knowledge as scientia is certain. And what kind of certainty? The certainty you get at the end of a syllogism about the correct, if the premises are true and the reasoning is valid, the certainty you have in the conclusion
A
of a syllogism.
justified true belief. But from
Uh, yeah, uh, that it would be a bit of a an anachronism just in terms of the sort of later 20th century philosophical discourse to sort of I wouldn't want to apply that into technical of a sense, um, but but in the substance of it, yes, right, yeah, it would be the kind of knowledge you get from deductive reasoning.
I'm absolutely trying to be non-technical.
Okay, that's fine.
Since
So
we're
yeah, sometimes you do all this studying and you get all these ideas in your head, and it makes you hyper nuanced in a way that's not helpful. So that's probably more my problem than yours. Um, but yeah, yeah, good. So that would be the biggest thing is to think this is not the product of the application of a method of an empirical method. It's the application of logical techniques to generate certitude. That's what science is. Science is certain knowledge.
So when he talks about the science of God itself prior to doctrine, is the logic, where is the logic being? I thought that that was referring to the things you're
Oh,
taking on
so in
faith.
that case, the science of God prior to doctrine is God's own certainty that God knows everything perfectly, and you don't need any discursive process for that.
Okay.
Because uh, because God is God. God doesn't have to learn anything, and God can't be mistaken. Um,
Okay.
God knows everything about everything. Full stop.
So that is a different version of this different use of the word science. Where
Well, so yes, it is. In that case, it's different because you don't need to use logical techniques to arrive at certitude because God doesn't need to get to certitude. Humans need to get to certitude through a
right.
process. God doesn't need to get to certitude. But it's the same in that what makes it scientific knowledge is that it's certain. That's what's the same. So what's the same is that it's scientific because it's certain. What's different is that God doesn't need a logical process to arrive at certitude.
Okay, I'm with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Yeah, that's one of those things, terminological things that you might just have to like have a little you might have to have a little pep talk with yourself every time you see it and go, right, that's not what science means here. I have lots of things like that I still have to like rehearse to myself. Right. In this context, it means this. Okay, good. Other questions?
And for
for Thomas, it would sacred science would include, or not include. It's the body of revelation that is then based on scripture or whatever, however we get.
Yeah, so it's both the body of revelation rooted in God's revelation in Scripture, but then in addition to that, remember this logical ideal. It's also the judgments that we can logically derive from those as first principles, right? Because they're
And move on from it. Start with the revelation as the first principle,
Yeah.
and then where does that take us?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So-
What can we sort of infer um, from these revealed principles of God? Yeah.
Right. You can take the principle of three persons and then you go with it, but
Right.
the principle is the principle.
Correct. Yeah.
So
That's right.
yeah. Okay.
That's right.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. So for next time, I want to look again at modules here. Oh, I'm in the wrong thing. Here we go. All right. I think that the reading for next time is our longest reading. So just a heads up on that as you're planning. I think it might be like 60 pages or something. It is the introductory chapter to Lonergan's textbook in Trinitarian theology. Um, and it's chronologically, it's not like the earliest reflection he has on theological method, but it is in some ways it hews the closest to Thomas, and it also most explicitly invokes the First Vatican Council, and so it's a pretty good baseline to set in terms of the sort of scholastic pre-Vatican II approach to theological method that Lonergan's going to take when he's teaching at the Gregorian. So yeah, so just set aside some time. It's a big hefty thump of a PDF, um, but we'll work our way through it next time, nice and methodically, so to speak.
On that text, I'm looking at it, and it looks like we have only the odd pages. Is that because the even are the Latin text or something?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
If you want to check
No.
the translation against the Latin, uh, uh, pin a rose on you, and
No.
I can send you the PDF, but I figured probably the English would be sufficient for our purposes.
Well, I printed it and I was like, oh no, I have only the
Oh.
odd pages. And it was like, oh, maybe it's so just clarifying.
It's just I just gave you the English pages there. So, all right. Any last questions or concerns and there's not like any assignments or anything in this thing, but I would ask that Lonergan thought that that questions were an expression of the innate human desire to know, and they're the thing that drive cognitional process for him. And so I would ask that you try to make something of a discipline when you're reading these things of keeping some record of the questions you have when you're reading, and then bring those to these. And I would much rather than me guess what's going to be of relevance to you or answer your questions, I would much rather have us be driven by you showing up with too many questions, and we'll get through as many as we can. That would be my preferred procedure. So, okay, great. Thanks, y'all. And
Thanks,
I'm
Jonathan.
hoping my domestic circumstances will be more, Pacific next time.
No, we got to see your fathering capabilities. We got to see your handling of the pets, all in a theological context.
The whole person, as they say.
That's right. That's right. We so appreciate you doing this, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. See you next week.
See everybody next week.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, have a good week.